Thank you. We have now the last of these opening speeches. Our fourth speaker speaking against the motion, former foreign editor of the New York Times, now columnist for that newspaper and for the International Herald Tribune. Please welcome Roger Cohen.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You know, it would be wonderful if the moon really was made of cheese. It would be wonderful if Jews and Arabs could live in harmony in the Holy Land, barriers fall, the United States butt out, as the motion I oppose has it, and peace at last prevail. In fact, more than wonderful, it would be wondrous. But that's not the world or the Middle East we live in. Fantasy, like inattention, is dangerous in the conduct of global affairs. We're dealing with the most scarred, most contested, most totemic patch of real estate on Earth. We're dealing with the legacy of war or near war ever since the United Nations passed Resolution 181 in November 1947, calling for the partition of Mandate Palestine and the establishment there of two states, one Jewish on 55% of the territory and one Palestinian on 42%, with the Jerusalem area 3% under UN trusteeship. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, not a million miles from what most of us might imagine could be a solution today. Arab armies invaded and lost. Losing became their habit. Today, 65 years on, the percentages for a proposed territorial division have changed in Palestinians' clear disfavor. The West Bank and Gaza amount to some 22% of the land, against the 42% originally on offer. Grievance, loss, division, estrangement, and zealotry have sharpened, not eased, the original confrontation. To imagine, to dream that in these circumstances, any peaceful resolution not advocated, shaped, and underwritten by a third party is as fanciful as saying that Europe could have risen from the ruins in 1945 without American help. But which third party? And Jeremy has gone over a little of this. I know, the world of 1945 is not the world of today. China and India are rising. How about them? Well, they're focused mainly on themselves. The Arab League has actually stirred into life since the Arab Spring began, but it's still largely on life support. Russia, well, its capacity for enlightened thinking has, I think, been encapsulated by Syria. And that leaves the United States, still the world's sole superpower. Now, Jeremy has spoken of America's failures and failings in Middle East diplomacy. They're real, they're substantial, they're embarrassing, they're failings of strategy, of focus, of balance. But let's face it, blaming America is also a pastime among the chattering classes. Big targets are easy targets. Iraq and Afghanistan have undermined the United States. It's not been a great decade since 9/11. But let's not forget U.S. achievements. Peace with Egypt, the work of Jimmy Carter. Peace with Jordan, signed at the White House under Bill Clinton. Some credible security on the West Bank now for the first time. The work of the U.S. military training Palestinian police forces. These are all critical developments that limit the possibility of renewed conflagration. In the broader region, as I suggested earlier, I think the Obama administration has worked in favor of the Arab Spring. Now, we don't know how this will play out in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria. That's opaque. But this much is clear. Arabs are focused on Arabs. They're focused on forging societies that are more open, more accountable, more transparent. They are not focused on Israel. They are no longer, as William evoked, being manipulated by Western-supported dictators who use the Israel-Palestinian conflict as a distraction. Now, we don't know how this will play out, but the history of democracies suggests that over time, and I believe this firmly, this should improve the possibilities for peace. America is also working hard to restrain Israel on Iran. Who else could? Nothing's more likely, in my view, than that an Israel from which the United States had butted out would feel compelled, or at least more drawn, to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. And that, I think, would be a disaster, and one that would inflame the region for many years, killing off any faint hopes of peace. Beyond the Middle East, ladies and gentlemen, what major transition in the last generation from conflict to peace has occurred without US involvement? The fall of the Berlin Wall and the integration of united Germany and the former Warsaw Pact states in the European Union and NATO, unthinkable without the brilliant diplomatic work of Bush Sr. and Jim Baker, the ending of the Bosnian War, Richard Holbrooke's work, the ending of the conflict in Kosovo, the work of America, peace in Ireland, only achieved through US mediation, and the critical shift in thinking of influential Irish Americans who told Gerry Adams the game was up. I think our opponents tonight have succumbed to fantasy. You know, I'd love nothing more than to share their illusions. As an American, why should my tax dollar support Sisyphean work? But I know Pax Americana because I've lived it. I've seen the garrisons, far-flung garrisons that sustain it. And I'm certain no other pax between Israelis and Palestinians is a serious proposition. Consider this basic fact. Any peace, any territorial division will involve the victorious power since 1948, Israel, giving up land for peace. That's what it did with Egypt. This is a risk. Nations do not take strategic risks lightly. Jews, in particular, are through with hoping for the best. Jews are through with trusting their neighbor. Jews are through with a wing and a prayer. Been there, tried that. Israel will not take the risk of giving up land, the risk I firmly believe it must take if it wants to remain a Jewish and democratic state, unless convinced it has the full commitment and guarantee of the United States to stand behind it should its concessions in the name of peace meet incitement in the name of war. The Palestinian pursuit, in other words, not of compromise on the 1967 borders, but of all the land. Therefore, if you're not interested in symbolic gestures, grand declarations at the UN and the like, you are bound to support American involvement and view arguments for butting out as what they are, a feel-good gesture that sounds good in a South Ken or West Village bistro, or even perhaps in a sushi bar in Ramallah, but does nothing in the end to do what I think we all want, make Palestinian lives better on the ground and move forward toward peace. Of course, US involvement must change character. Prime Minister Netanyahu has toyed with President Obama. For the president to end up at the UN vetoing his own words on freezing West Bank settlements shows how far domestic political considerations can skew American endeavor. This has to stop. The success of my partner Jeremy's organization, J Street, demonstrates that sentiment is changing in the American Jewish community. Criticism of Israel is no longer taboo. An important idea is sinking in, that to be a friend of Israel, you can, indeed, you must be a critical friend. As the Irish example I gave earlier suggests, the evolution over time of American Jewish sentiment will be important for more balanced and effective US peacemaking efforts. Just as Irish Americans made a difference in Ireland, so can American Jews in Israel. As this process continues, here are a few necessary US steps, in my view. First, Focus on product, not process. Be bolder in laying out the known parameters of solution. There are no secrets in the concessions both sides have to make. In fact, it's very like what I described in 1947. The concessions on settlements, on the right of return, on guarantees for Israeli security, on Jerusalem. In other words, get more involved. Second, be a genuine... It's no good President Obama saying the 1967 lines are a good starting point and then walking away from it. Follow through. At the UN, 3 months later, he didn't even mention it. That's not consistent and it's not serious. Second, be a genuine mediator, not Israel's lawyer. Give ironclad guarantees to Israel on security, but convey how real security in the long term must involve territorial trade-off if Israel is to be a Jewish and democratic state. Israel is to live by the values enshrined in its founding charter and not be and continue to be a nation exercising a corrosive, unacceptable dominion over another people. Third, reassure Israel and gain the credibility of both parties through a presidential visit early in what I expect to be a second Obama term. There has to be a rapport between Palestinians and Israelis with the president as this moves forward. Fourth, respect and encourage Palestinian democracy and unity. The majority on both sides is still for peace. The trick is getting the majority to be heard. Fifth, bring in a new team. Break with the failure of the past clearly. The likes of Dennis Ross have had their day. And sixth, build a strong coalition going beyond the quartet. Ladies and gentlemen, I've witnessed and feel on my conscience as a Jew the daily humiliations inflicted on Palestinians. I know we're contemplating the world's greatest geostrategic failure since World War II. Do something. Change everything, be radical. The clamor is understandable, and I understand how our opponents tonight have succumbed to it. But in a shipwreck, it's generally wise to cling to the wreckage rather than head off into unknown depths. Rather than butt out, the US should change tack and do so with new balance, focus, intensity, and consistency. It should not embarrass us as it has. A century ago, Kipling warned us of the temptations of illusion and fantasy. He wrote, "When the Cambrian measures were forming, they promised perpetual peace. They swore, if we gave them our weapons, that the ways of the tribes would cease. But when we disarmed, they sold us and delivered us bound to our foe. And the gods of the copybook headings said, 'Stick to the devil, you know.'" Yes, ladies and gentlemen, in the Middle East, if we really want peace, we would be wise to stick to the devil we know, the flawed great power that has done more than any other to extend democracy and peace in the world since 1945. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As you know, that was the last of our 4 speeches. We're just going to have a quick fire of questions, starting with you, William Seacott.
Roger, you've accused our side of living in a fantasy world, but isn't it a bigger fantasy to expect someone to change their behaviour after 40 years of going in the wrong direction? I mean, all your 6 points, I think, are absolutely correct, but what on earth makes you feel that suddenly the United States and President Obama are going to change?
Well, I think American exasperation is growing. There is a recognition on the strategic plane that this conflict is not in the U.S. interest. General Petraeus is not alone in seeing that this conflict is a radicalizing factor in the Arab world, and that if jihadism has inflicted a terrible price on the United States, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is clearly a powerful recruitment tool. So that awareness is growing. In addition, as both Jeremy and I have tried to suggest, and I'm not saying this will happen overnight, I do think there is a real shift in the American Jewish community, which will, in time, and I know why you'd be skeptical, but in time will be reflected in Congress and in the White House. American Jews are uncomfortable in growing numbers with an Israel that occupies and oppresses another people, an Israel at risk of losing its Jewish and democratic character.
Thank you. Mustafa Barghouti, a quick question.
Roger, you spoke about making the life of the Palestinians better through the administration today. But do you know that today the Palestinians, after all these institution building acts, today Palestinians have the 6th highest rate of unemployment in the world? We have 38% of our budget spent on security apparatus, and we have constant violations of human rights of the Palestinian people. And the best model that they have is to make the Palestinian Authority a security sub-agent for Israel. Is that the solution? And what is the motivation for the United States to change? I did not hear a single thing about any motivation, anything that would motivate them.
Okay, quick answer if you can, Roger.
Well, on the motivation, I think I just tried to explain that the U.S. has really determined that this conflict is not in its strategic interest. If it's not in its strategic interest, it should do something about it. Mustafa, I'm not going to argue with you on the abject, terrible conditions in the West Bank. I've witnessed them, I've written about them, and they trouble me. On the other hand, I do think that Prime Minister Fayyad has done some very serious work, that the World Bank, after all, declared Palestine recently ready for statehood now. New cinemas have opened, new apartments are being built, new towns, new roads. I think there have been some improvements, but from a very, very low base, and life continues to be humiliating and difficult for many Palestinians.
Roger Cohen. Thank you.